What do we really mean when we call something ancient? A date on a museum label? A layer of dust? Or the uneasy feeling that the people who came before us may have understood the world in ways we have only partially learned to name? History often arrives as a straight line. First came survival, then farming, then cities, then temples, then science. It is a comforting sequence, tidy and teachable. But every so often, the earth gives back an object, a wall, a chamber, a monument that refuses to stay inside that order. And when it does, the past stops feeling finished. It feels alive again, like a voice traveling under stone. Across deserts, islands, mountains, and drowned coastlines, there are places that carry this disturbance. A sanctuary raised before the first known towns. A city whose builders vanished from memory while their avenues still pointed toward the sky. Stones moved across impossible distances for reasons that do not fit neatly inside utility. Underground worlds carved with such foresight that they seem to anticipate catastrophe itself. These are not simply ruins, they are questions in physical form. To stand before such places is to feel two emotions at once: wonder and humility. Wonder because human beings, even at the edge of hunger, fear, and uncertainty, have always reached for meaning. Humility because our explanations, however careful, are often smaller than the evidence left behind. We date, we measure, we compare, and still there remains that quiet remainder, the part that resists being filed away. This journey is not about proving hidden worlds or chasing easy myths. It is about listening more carefully to what old stones, buried chambers, and forgotten alignments may be trying to tell us about memory, imagination, and the long reach of human intelligence. Because the deeper question is not whether the past was mysterious. It is whether we have mistaken familiarity for understanding. What if the first great monument in human history was not a house, a wall, or a granary, but a question carved into stone? On a bare hill in what is now southeastern Turkey, the wind moves through grass and broken limestone as if the land itself is trying to remember. Long before cities, before pottery, before the settled routines we usually associate with civilization, people came here and raised enormous pillars from the earth. They shaped them into silent T-forms, carved animals across their surfaces, and arranged them in circles that feel less like buildings than conversations with the invisible. This is Göbekli Tepe, a place old enough to disturb our confidence. Its earliest layers reach back to a time when human communities were still living by hunting and gathering. That fact alone should make the site impossible. Monumental architecture, by the usual telling, is supposed to come later. First, food surplus, then hierarchy, then temples. But here, the order seems to bend. Here belief may have arrived before the city did. Imagine the labor involved. Teams of people cutting stone with simple tools, bodies hauling pillars that weigh many tons, hands carving foxes, vultures, snakes and scorpions with astonishing control. And then, after all that effort, no clear evidence of ordinary domestic life. No kitchens, no homes, no everyday clutter of settlement. The place seems to have been built not for living, but for gathering, for ceremony, perhaps for memory. Then comes the strangest gesture of all. After centuries of use, the enclosures were deliberately buried, not ruined by war, not slowly abandoned, carefully covered, almost as if the builders were sealing something away for another age. Archaeologists continue to debate what this place means. Was it a sanctuary? A seasonal meeting ground? The seed of organized religion? Perhaps all of these, perhaps none. But the deeper mystery may be simpler and more unsettling. If people could imagine something this vast before agriculture fully took hold, then maybe civilization did not begin with bread alone. Maybe it began with awe. It started with a city that had no single king's name attached to it, and perhaps that is part of why it feels so modern. At Mohenjo-daro, in the broad floodplains of the Indus Valley, the ruins do not rise like a monument to conquest. They lie in ordered silence. Streets meet at careful angles. Houses were built with standardized bricks. Wells appear throughout the city, as if access to water was not a luxury for the few, but a necessity woven into daily life. Even now, from above, the place looks less like a royal dream and more like a collective agreement. There is something deeply moving in that image. We often expect the ancient world to announce itself through palaces, triumphal inscriptions, or tombs built for the powerful. But Mohenjo-daro tells a quieter story. It suggests that one of humanity's earliest urban experiments may have been defined not by spectacle, but by planning. Drainage channels ran beneath the streets. Bathing spaces were built into homes. A great public bath, still famous today, hints at ritual, civic order, or perhaps both. The city appears to have understood something essential. Civilization is not only what we build upward, but what we arrange between one another. And yet the silence is incomplete. Their script remains undeciphered. Their rulers, if they had them, do not stand before us in grand statues speaking their names across time. We see craft, trade, design, and discipline, but not the inner voice that held it all together. It is one of history's great frustrations, to witness intelligence everywhere in the archaeological record and still be unable to hear the language that organized its thoughts. Then, as with so many early worlds, the pattern changed. Rivers shifted, trade weakened, settlements transformed. The great urban network of the Indus civilization did not vanish in a single dramatic stroke. It seems to have thinned, adapted, and receded. Perhaps that is why Mohenjo-daro lingers in the mind. It reminds us that sophistication does not always leave behind a loud legacy. Sometimes the most advanced idea is not domination, but balance. And sometimes what disappears is not failure, but a form of order we still do not fully know how to recognize. What can a road remember after the people are gone? Deep in the Amazon basin, where the forest breathes in layers and rivers turn like living mirrors, there was once a powerful assumption that this immense green world had always been mostly empty of large, organized human life. The jungle seemed to encourage that conclusion. It hides quickly. It folds walls into roots, terraces into moss, geometry into shadow. For centuries, the forest looked less like an archive than an eraser. But the ground has begun to answer back. Across parts of the Amazon, researchers have uncovered traces of broad causeways, earthworks, ceremonial platforms, canals, and settlements carefully shaped into the landscape. Some sites reveal circles and squares etched into the earth, so large they can only be fully understood from above. Others suggest planned communities connected by raised roads, as if the forest was once threaded by systems of movement, exchange, and ritual. What seemed wild and untouched may, in places, be the long-after image of human design. This does not mean the old fantasy of a lost super-civilization waiting to be glorified. The truth is more interesting and more humane. It suggests that many indigenous societies in Amazonia may have developed sophisticated ways of living with the forest rather than against it. They managed soil, shaped waterways, cultivated useful species, and created forms of settlement that did not rely on stone monuments to announce their presence. Their intelligence was ecological, relational, and easy for outsiders to overlook precisely because it was not built in the image of empire. That misunderstanding has consequences. When later generations fail to recognize complexity unless it arrives in marble or bronze, they also fail to recognize the many forms human wisdom can take. The Amazon's hidden roads and earthworks invite a quieter kind of revelation. Perhaps the past is not absent where we do not immediately see it. Perhaps it is concealed by our habits of looking. And perhaps one of history's most enduring blind spots has been the belief that what lasts the longest must also be what mattered most. It began, as many mysteries do, with a ruin standing in plain sight and still refusing to explain itself. On the Mediterranean island of Malta, under a sky of pale heat and sea wind, stone temples rise from the earth with a gravity that feels older than language. Their walls are thick, curved, almost organic, as if shaped less by engineering than by memory. Some of these structures were already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were young. That fact alone unsettles the imagination. We tend to place human achievement on a simple ladder, but here are monuments that step outside the sequence and wait for us to catch up. The temples of Hagar Chim, Mohenjo-daro, and other Maltese sites do not overwhelm through height. Their power is quieter. Massive stones form doorways, chambers, apses, and altars aligned with light and season. In certain moments of the year, the sun enters with astonishing precision, touching particular thresholds as if the builders had entered into a long conversation with the horizon. This was not accidental construction. It was intention, written in limestone. And yet the people who built these places remain strangely distant. We do not know their names. We know little about their beliefs, beyond the hints left in carvings, figurines, and the architecture itself. There are signs of ritual, of shared labor, perhaps of reverence linked to fertility, renewal, or cosmic order. But certainty slips away each time we reach for it. The temples offer evidence, not confession. Then, just as mysteriously, that temple-building culture faded. The reasons remain debated. Environmental strain, social change, isolation, shifting belief, each may have played a role. What remains are the stones, still holding their silence under sun and weather. There is something deeply human in that silence. We build to remember, yet time keeps editing the story. Malta's temples remind us that sophistication is not always followed by permanence, and that disappearance is not the same as insignificance. Sometimes a civilization leaves behind no empire, no famous chronicle, no surviving voice, only architecture so patient and so precise that it continues asking, across 5,000 years, what kind of meaning we once knew how to build together. What survives when the sea decides to keep its own history? Off the coast of Yonaguni, at the far edge of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, divers descend through clear blue water and find a formation that seems to challenge the boundary between geology and intention. There are broad terraces, sharp angles, flat platforms, and steep faces that resemble steps cut by design. Light moves across the stone in wavering bands, and for a moment, the mind does what it so often does in the presence of ambiguity. It starts to build a story. Is this the remnant of a lost human structure now claimed by the ocean? Or is it a natural formation whose fractures and planes only happen to imitate architecture? The debate has endured for decades, not because the answers are simple, but because the site sits precisely where wonder and caution meet. Those who see the monument as human-made point to its apparent symmetry, its layered surfaces, and the suggestive arrangement of surrounding features. They imagine a coastline from another age, when lower seas exposed land now hidden below. Others, including many geologists, argue that the sandstone in this region naturally breaks along regular lines, producing shapes that can look startlingly deliberate. In that reading, Yonaguni is not evidence of a forgotten civilization, but a lesson in how easily human pattern-seeking can turn stone into myth. And perhaps that is what makes the site so compelling. Even if the monument is entirely natural, it reveals something important about us. We are creatures of form and inference. We look at the world and instinctively ask whether someone was here before us. We search for traces of intention, because intention is how we make meaning. The ocean deepens that instinct. It covers, distorts, preserves, and erases all at once. Entire coastlines from the Ice Age now lie underwater, and with them the possibility that some chapters of early human life remain beyond easy reach. Yonaguni, whatever its ultimate origin, draws us toward that submerged uncertainty. Not every mystery is a secret waiting to be solved. Some are mirrors, showing us how knowledge itself is made, through evidence, doubt, imagination, and restraint. And sometimes the most honest answer is not certainty, but the willingness to keep looking beneath the surface. It started with a city built high enough to touch the clouds and quiet enough to sound like memory. Machu Picchu rests along a narrow Andean ridge where stone meets mist, and the mountains seem to breathe in slow, ancient rhythm. At dawn, the terraces catch the first light, like folded pages opening one by one. The site is so visually complete, so perfectly held within its landscape, that it can feel less like a ruin than a thought preserved in altitude. And yet, for all its beauty, its true purpose remains elusive. The Inca built with a confidence that still humbles modern eyes. Stones were cut and joined so precisely that mortar was barely needed. Agricultural terraces climbed the slopes in deliberate bands, managing water, soil, and steep terrain with remarkable intelligence. Temples, houses, and ceremonial spaces were arranged in relation to the surrounding peaks, as though architecture here was not imposed upon nature, but composed with it, like music written for a specific instrument. For many visitors, the mystery is irresistible. Was this a royal estate, a sacred retreat, an observatory, a seasonal center of ritual and administration? The evidence suggests several of these at once. That is often the case with places we try to simplify after the fact. Human spaces are rarely only one thing. They gather meanings the way mountains gather weather. Then there is the ache beneath the grandeur. The site was abandoned during the upheaval that followed the Spanish conquest, though the conquerors appear never to have fully known it. In that sense, Machu Picchu survived not through triumph, but through absence. It was left behind, hidden in plain sight by distance, vegetation, and time, until the modern world turned its gaze upon it again. Its endurance invites a deeper reflection. We often imagine history as a contest between what is found and what is lost, as though rediscovery restores what time has taken. But recovery is never complete. A place can be mapped, measured, photographed, and still remain partly beyond us. Perhaps that is why Machu Picchu continues to move people so deeply. It reminds us that mastery and mystery are not opposites. Sometimes the greatest human achievements are those that still leave room for silence, and for the possibility that some meanings are meant to be approached with reverence rather than possession. What if an entire world could disappear not beneath the sea, but beneath the ground under our feet? In central Anatolia, the land around Cappadocia appears soft at first glance. Rolling hills, volcanic stone, valleys carved by wind and time. But below that gentle surface lies something astonishing. Vast underground cities cut into the earth with patience, strategy, and extraordinary foresight. The most famous of them, Derinkuyu, descends through multiple levels into darkness, revealing chambers for storage, worship, shelter, and daily life. It is less a cave than a buried architecture of survival. To walk through such spaces is to feel the imagination of danger. Narrow corridors twist deliberately. Heavy circular stones could be rolled into place to seal passages. Ventilation shafts rise toward the surface with careful engineering, carrying breath into the deep. Families, animals, food stores, and tools could all be sustained below ground for extended periods. These were not improvised hiding places. They were built for recurrence, for the expectation that crisis might come again. Who first began carving them remains a matter of historical debate, and over centuries, different communities used and expanded these subterranean networks. That layered history matters. It reminds us that survival itself can become a kind of inheritance. One generation shapes refuge, another enlarges it, another prays within it, another forgets it until fear returns. Underground, time does not vanish, it accumulates. There is something deeply poignant in the logic of these cities. Above ground, civilizations usually display their confidence through towers, walls, and monuments visible from afar. Below ground, the message changes. Here, architecture is not about announcing power, but protecting vulnerability. It is about making room for life when the open world becomes uncertain. And perhaps that is why Derinkuyu continues to resonate beyond archaeology. It speaks to a truth that feels both ancient and familiar. Human beings have always tried to prepare for storms they cannot control. We build shelters, systems, rituals, and stories not because we know what is coming, but because uncertainty has always been one of our oldest companions. In the end, the underground city is more than a marvel of engineering. It is a portrait of endurance, proof that sometimes the most profound expression of civilization is not how high we rise, but how carefully we preserve one another when the light begins to fade. It began with stones placed so deliberately that even now, after thousands of years, they seem to hold a conversation with the sky. On the Salisbury Plain of southern England, Stonehenge rises from open grassland with a presence that is both familiar and difficult to explain. We know its silhouette almost too well. It appears in textbooks, postcards, films, and tourist photographs, and yet the closer we look, the stranger it becomes. Familiarity has not solved it. It has only made us forget how improbable it really is. The monument was not built all at once. It evolved over many centuries, shaped by different hands across different generations. Earthworks came first, then timber structures, then the great standing stones that now define the site. Some of those stones traveled astonishing distances, brought from Wales across rugged land and water long before wheels played a major role in Britain. That effort alone suggests that Stonehenge was never merely practical. It mattered in a way that justified devotion on a scale we still struggle to fully imagine. Its alignments deepen the mystery. The site clearly engages with the movement of the sun, especially at the solstices, linking stone, season, and ceremony in a pattern that feels both scientific and sacred. This was not astronomy in the modern sense, stripped of feeling. It was observation woven into ritual, a way of placing human life inside a larger rhythm of light and darkness, return and departure. Archaeologists have found evidence that the landscape around Stonehenge was part of a wider ceremonial world filled with avenues, burial sites, and neighboring monuments. In other words, Stonehenge was not an isolated wonder. It belonged to a cultural ecosystem of memory, mourning, gathering, and cosmic attention. The stones are simply the part that remained most visibly upright. Perhaps that is why Stonehenge endures so powerfully in the imagination. It reminds us that ancient people were not only trying to survive the year, they were trying to understand it, to inhabit time with dignity and wonder. In that sense, the monument is less a puzzle than a posture. It shows human beings standing in the open, looking at the heavens, and refusing to believe that the passing of seasons was only a fact, and not also a meaning. What if the greatest mystery of an island was not how its statues were moved, but why we keep assuming a culture must have failed in order to astonish us? Far out in the Pacific, Rapa Nui rises from the ocean like a fragment of thought carried too far from shore. The wind there has a different quality, clean, insistent, almost intimate. Across its slopes stand the moai, the famous stone figures carved with long faces and grave stillness, as if watching not only the land, but the generations passing through it. To encounter them is to feel both admiration and unease. They are unmistakably human, and yet they seem to belong to another register of time. For years, popular narratives reduced the island to a cautionary tale. The statues became symbols of excess, proof, some said, that a remote society exhausted its own world and collapsed under the weight of its ambition. It was a tidy story, dramatic and morally convenient. But history, when treated with care, is rarely so eager to become a parable. More recent scholarship has suggested a far more complex picture, one shaped by adaptation, resilience, and later devastation brought by outside forces, including disease, enslavement, and colonial disruption. That shift matters. It changes the moral geometry of the island. The moai were not simply products of obsession, they were part of a sophisticated cultural and spiritual landscape involving ancestor veneration, quarrying, transport, ceremony, and community labor. Even the act of moving the statues, once treated as an impossible feat, now appears increasingly understandable through collective technique rather than lost magic. Human ingenuity, once again, proves sufficient when given enough patience and cooperation. And still, the statues keep their power. They stand on Ahu platforms facing inland, many of them oriented not toward the sea, but toward the people, as if their gaze was always meant to remain relational. They are less monuments to ego than embodiments of continuity, ways of keeping the dead present among the living. Rapa Nui asks something difficult of us. It asks whether we can look at the past without forcing it into stories that flatter our certainty. Sometimes the deeper truth is not collapse, but endurance under pressures we did not fully see. And sometimes the faces carved in stone are not warnings from a failed world, but witnesses from one that understood memory as a form of care. It began with a mountain of stone so immense that we have almost trained ourselves not to be surprised by it. At Giza, the pyramids stand beneath the Egyptian sun with an authority that photographs cannot quite carry. Their edges are softened now by time, but their intention remains unmistakable. They were built to endure, to command horizon and imagination alike. And perhaps the most extraordinary fact is not that they exist, but that they have existed for so long that wonder itself has become routine. The Great Pyramid, in particular, still resists simplicity. It is an engineering achievement, of staggering precision, aligned with the cardinal directions and assembled with a discipline that continues to invite both admiration and speculation. For some, that very scale seems to demand an otherworldly explanation. But the deeper story may be more profound precisely because it is human. Thousands of workers, planners, stonecutters, haulers, organizers, and artisans participating in a project that linked labor to belief, mathematics to ritual, mortality to the stars. The pyramids were never merely tombs in the narrow sense. They were part of a vast, sacred landscape of causeways, temples, and carefully structured symbolism. In ancient Egypt, death was not understood as an ending without architecture. It required passage, preparation, orientation. To build for the afterlife was also to build for continuity, to place one life within an ordered cosmos, where decay could be answered by form. And yet even here, in one of the most studied places on Earth, mystery remains. Hidden chambers are still being investigated. Debates continue over methods, labor organization, and the full meanings of particular spaces. Knowledge accumulates, but it does not close the monument. The pyramids remain legible and elusive at once, as if they were designed not only to house the dead, but to humble the living. Perhaps that is why Giza continues to occupy such a singular place in human thought. It reminds us that permanence is one of our oldest dreams and also one of our oldest illusions. Stone lasts longer than flesh, but even stone cannot fully preserve intention. What survives is shape, alignment, devotion, and the trace of an effort so immense that it still asks us, across millennia, what kind of future human beings were hoping to build when they built against death itself? What if the map was wrong? Not because it lied, but because it remembered too much in the language of longing. For centuries, maps were more than instruments. They were acts of imagination disciplined by measurement, stitched together from sailors' reports, inherited texts, fear, hope, and rumor. On their edges lived coastlines no traveler had fully confirmed, islands that drifted between editions, and southern lands drawn less from sight than from belief in symmetry. The unknown was not left blank. It was given shape. Among the most haunting of these visions was the idea of a great land beyond the horizon, a balancing continent in the far south, a place many mapmakers assumed had to exist because the world itself seemed to demand proportion. Elsewhere appeared islands now lost to certainty, names preserved longer than their evidence, lands reported, copied, trusted, doubted, then copied again. In this way, cartography became a record not only of geography, but of human expectation. To modernize, these phantom places can look like error. And of course, in one sense, they were. But error is sometimes too simple a word. Early maps reveal how knowledge grows through approximation. A coastline glimpsed in stormlight can become a kingdom in ink. A misunderstood current, a distant cloud bank. A retold voyage can harden into form. Then, just as gradually, the form dissolves under better observation. The map changes, but the older version remains as evidence of the mind reaching outward before proof could keep pace. There is something tender in that process. We like to imagine discovery as clean correction, myth replaced by fact. Yet the truth is more human. People do not move from ignorance to knowledge in a straight line. They travel through metaphor, confidence, revision, and wonder. Their mistakes often reveal what they considered possible, necessary, or beautiful. And that may be why old maps still move us. They show that the world was never only a physical expanse waiting to be measured. It was also a canvas for desire a place where the limits of sight met the architecture of belief. In the end, the lost continent is not just a missing landmass. It is a reminder that every age draws its own horizon, and that what we place beyond it says as much about us as the world we are trying to find. It started with the belief that somewhere, just beyond the reach of proof, there had once been a motherland of memory. Again and again, human beings have told stories about places that vanished, a city swallowed by the sea, an island kingdom erased by fire, a golden age broken by flood, migration, or forgetting. These legends appear across cultures not because all of them describe the same literal event, but because loss is one of humanity's oldest languages. We do not only remember what survives, we also remember what should have remained and did not. That instinct has shaped the way many people look at ancient ruins, old maps, and unexplained sites. Faced with fragments, we are tempted to weave them into a single grand inheritance, a lost civilization from which everything else descended. It is a powerful idea, elegant in its simplicity, but history rarely arranges itself so neatly. Human achievement did not bloom in only one place and then scatter outward unchanged. More often, it emerged in many regions, in many forms, through adaptation, trade, isolation, imagination, and necessity. And yet the longing behind the lost continent myth deserves respect. Beneath the fantasy is a recognizable human hope that our divisions are recent and that somewhere in the deep past there was a more unified story, a beginning before borders, a world in which knowledge had not yet been broken into separate names. Even if such visions cannot be accepted as fact, they still reveal something true about the emotional life of history. We want connection. We want continuity. We want to believe that what is scattered might once have been whole. Archaeology, at its best, offers a more grounded form of that same comfort. It shows us that distant peoples were never as distant as we imagine. Ideas traveled, techniques echoed, symbolic thinking appeared again and again, in ways both independent and strangely resonant. Across oceans and centuries, human beings kept asking similar questions about death, sky, season, origin, and belonging. Perhaps that is the deeper inheritance, not a single vanished empire, but a shared habit of wonder. The lost world we keep searching for may not have been one place at all. It may be the human capacity to make meaning against the silence and to leave behind just enough traces for future generations to feel less alone in time. In the end, what remains is not a single answer, but a way of seeing. We began with stones, roads, temples, buried chambers, drowned shapes, and lines drawn on old maps. We followed them across continents and centuries, through sites that unsettled familiar timelines and stories that blurred the border between memory and imagination. Some places offered hard archaeological evidence. Others offered ambiguity. A few existed less as destinations than as mirrors, reflecting the hopes and uncertainties of the people who searched for them. Taken together, they do not prove that the past was magical. They reveal something more compelling, that human history is richer, stranger, and more emotionally layered than any simple narrative can contain. There is a temptation, when faced with mystery, to rush towards certainty, to turn every unexplained monument into a secret, every gap in the record into a hidden world, every silence into proof of what we most want to believe. But the deeper discipline of history asks for something quieter. It asks us to stay with complexity, to let evidence lead, while also honoring the fact that evidence is never the whole of human experience. Civilizations leave behind walls, bones, tools, art, alignments, and ash. They do not leave behind their full interior life. We inherit the structure of their questions more often than the complete shape of their answers. And maybe that is enough, maybe more than enough, because what these ancient places ultimately reveal is not just the scale of forgotten achievement, but the continuity of human longing. Across every era, people have looked at the sky and asked where they stand. They have built against death, against chaos, against oblivion. They have made spaces for worship, for safety, for memory, for the living and the dead to remain in conversation. They have tried to understand the land, the seasons, the sea, and the invisible order they sense behind it all. We do the same, though in different materials. So perhaps the true lost continent was never a vanished landmass, waiting beneath the ocean or hidden on an old chart. Perhaps it is the vast territory between what we know and what we can still feel, the place where fact meets wonder, where scholarship meets humility, where the past stops being a museum and becomes a human inheritance. And the question that lingers is not whether ancient people were wiser than we imagine. It is whether we are wise enough to listen when their silence still speaks.